All right, so we are starting a new topic today, industry and immigration. These are two enormous ideas that we could really spend so much time discussing separately, sort of the bits and pieces of each. But of course, we do have some time constraints, so we are compressing our conversation a little bit. And what I am going to strive to do in this presentation is hit the high points of industry and immigration. So please make sure that you are keeping up with your reading, that you're working on that digital notebook for topic 2, and keeping an eye out for these key terms throughout our time discussing industry and immigration. We may not discuss every single one, or we will not discuss every single one in this presentation today, but as we go forward, we will be mentioning all of them. So make sure that you know and are familiar with all of these terms and ideas. Also with these sort of big picture ideas. We're going to situate ourselves, give us a context of the late 1800s. We are done with the Civil War. Remember, Reconstruction ends in 1877. What does this new America look like post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction? Well, we really go through a second industrialization. We finally urbanize. We build factories. We have factory workers. We also have a new immigrant coming primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe and also from Asia. How does that impact the American experience? And how does the rise of something called nativism, the return of nativism, impact those immigrant communities? So we're going to be talking about new technologies, entrepreneurship, all of those related issues. And so here are some questions, some things to make sure that you can do. Can you explain the economic effect of technological innovation? Can you answer this question? How did the free enterprise system impact the rise of entrepreneurship? What impact did energy and natural resources have on the American way of life? Can you understand mass production and its impact? What technological innovations impacted agriculture? What were issues that impacted farming specifically in the South? Remember, Reconstruction kind of failed to sort of quote unquote reconstruct the infrastructure in the South. So what new challenges or even old challenges are present for farmers in the South? How did management innovations help businesses gain an advantage? What were the causes and effects of something called social Darwinism? Can you understand monopolies and the laws attempting to regulate those monopolies? And finally, can you explain economic opportunities, both denied and available to immigrant communities, and the impact of nativism on those communities? We can do it. We're going to do it all slowly, sort of one step at a time. So the United States industrialized, as we talked about this idea of a second industrialization after the Civil War. And this chart is super handy, a nice little, as it says, visual summary of what that means. Starting to the top and moving to the right. The second industrialization is going to mean an expansion of railroads. We're going to be talking about that today. Larger factories, meaning greater production. Because we have a bigger population, all of a sudden, after the Civil War, there's a population boom. So people are buying more stuff. You got to have more, bigger factories and more workers to produce those things. Massive profits are going to be available for these business tycoons, sometimes called robber barons. An emerging labor union system, the arrival of electricity, a communication revolution, think about the telegraph, advances in transportation, difficult conditions for industrial workers, new forms of business organization, and the development of the steel and oil industries. Very important. We've sort of talked about this. I'm not going to read everything to you. But in the South, we're looking at cities like Atlanta and, believe it or not, Knoxville, Tennessee, sort of being the examples of urbanization in the South. But in general, people in the South are still farmers. And there is a really wide gap between who has the money in the South. It tends to be you're either a wealthy owner of a large tract of land or you're a poor farmer working very hard just to feed your family. So take a moment to look at this chart that shows the per capita income in the South. from 1860 to 1880 and how that compares to the rest of the nation. The distribution of income at the top is really significant, but the distribution of population doesn't change too much. Natural resources. So we talked about all of a sudden after the Civil War, there's this huge boom in industrialization, and really quickly, it feels like almost overnight, the United States is becoming a leader when it comes to industry. Why? Well, part of the reason is super cheap and very abundant natural resources. Timber, coal, iron, copper, all of this. And we have the Transcontinental Railroad to get to those resources, which are out west. So the railroad being built is going to allow people to get on a train, go out west, live in a newly settled community out there, mine for iron or copper or whatever. Those resources are put on the train and it goes back to the population centers back east, where the larger cities are, where the industry is. No railroad, no growth. No Western settlement, no railroad. It all sort of goes hand in hand. And we also have a new desire for oil. So we have the growth of the oil industry. Here we go. Growth in mineral production. I should make a note. Do you want to say something about that last thing down there, kerosene lamps? This is going to allow workers to work later hours because now they can see in a factory in the dark. So it all impacts everything. Here's a growth in mineral production. You can see it's directly related to the growth of the American economy. Another resource that America has that makes it so successful when it comes to industrializing is the American workforce. The U.S. population almost triples between 1860 and 1910, and you can look at that chart and sort of see where the population centers are. They are not in the South. So it's important for industrialization. Why is it growing? How is it growing? It's growing through immigration, and it's also growing because people are living longer. Children are surviving childhood, which is wonderful, where they were not before. So families are larger. This is a worker in a textile mill in the early 1900s. We can think about how she is a symbol of what we might call the new Southern economy, the new South post-Reconstruction. So, new innovations. We're going to improve transportation and technology. We've talked about all of this. And look down here on the bottom right. Look at these innovators. In the 1830s all the way to 1903. We've got planes down there. We've got the typewriter, the telephone, the telegraph. We have the elevator. Otis is still like the elevator company, right? So if you don't have an elevator, you can't live in a skyscraper. All of these things are going to impact the American lifestyle, including something called the Bessemer process. I'm going to play a video clip for you that explains exactly what that is and why it's important to the steel industry.
Making steel in massive quantities was one of the great technological challenges of the Industrial Revolution. But it turns out that the secret to creating this mega material was known as far back as 300 BC, when it was made in India and Sri Lanka. The trick to creating this metal was in getting the exact right combination of steel's two main components, iron and carbon. But today, steel is everywhere. So how did it become the workhorse of the modern world? The answer is Henry Bessemer. Bessemer was a British scientist who in 1856 figured out an efficient way to turn iron and carbon into steel. He did it by using hot blasts of oxygen inside a specialized furnace to reduce the amount of carbon in the metal.
The Bessemer process made steel production far more efficient than it ever had been in history.
If you want to make good, high-quality steel, you blow pure oxygen through the iron, and this oxidizes the carbon that is in the iron.
With temperatures over 2,000 degrees, the oxygen is literally burning the carbon out of the steel. Every day, 17,000 tons of iron ore pours into the furnaces at the ArcelorMittal Steel Mill in Cleveland, Ohio. And each year, this sprawling 1,000-acre facility single-handedly cranks out enough raw steel to build a train track around the globe.
This plant is the most efficient integrated steel plant anywhere in the world. There's always a hot stove online.
Foundries like this one use extreme heat and heavy machinery to blast away impurities from the iron ore and infuse carbon, creating a metal stronger, more flexible, and less dense than iron. Turning low-grade ore into the most used metal in the world starts at a 200-foot tall furnace. This is where the iron ore is hit with heat generated by a type of fuel called coke.
Coke is the result of burning the impurities and the junk out of coal that you don't need to get to the good stuff, which is going to burn cleanly and give you the nice, hot, clean fire that you need to make steel.
It's called the blast furnace because as the ore and coke flow downward, they're met by a 1,600-degree blast of hot air moving at 110,000 cubic feet per minute.
The wind is coming in at what we call the Bosch level of the furnace through nozzles, which are called tweers, and we have 18 of them, depending on the size of the blast furnace. That air is pushing up through a solid burden material.
The superheated air ignites the coke like charcoal in a grill and heats up the furnace to nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the oxygen is finally blasted away, leaving pure molten iron. But it's also doing something even more amazing. As the heat from the coke flame strips away the oxygen, the carbon in the coke is bonding to the iron.
You have hot blast going in. You have the material going in at the top of the furnace. And it's melting, and as it's melting, it's going down.
Under the extreme heat, the mixture liquefies. Impurities like silica and sulfur rise to the top. The heavier iron sinks to the bottom, where it's drawn out in a glowing molten stream.
The furnace until it turns into liquid, and it comes out the tap hole.
Every 45 minutes, some 500 tons of molten metal, called pig iron, gushes from the tap. It's called pig iron because it was originally cast into molds resembling piglets suckling a sow. But ironically, though the iron has been freed from the oxygen, the molten pig iron that flows from the furnace has a new problem: too much carbon. Over 4%, which makes the resulting metal much too brittle. To become steel, that number needs to be reduced to less than 2%.
It's all one continuous process.
We want a very specific strength level. We need the carbon in a very critical range.
To get it right, the carbon-loaded pig iron must undergo one final treatment in the oxygen furnace. Inside this iron cask, the molten steel, already at more than 2,000 degrees, is blasted with jets of pure oxygen. The molten steel ignites the oxygen, only this time the fuel isn't coke. It's the actual carbon atoms bonded to the iron. Basically, the molten material itself is burning.
We flow 25,000 cubic feet of oxygen per minute into the bath in the vessel. The oxygen reacts with the carbon and reduces the carbon level.
The longer and hotter it burns, the more the carbon burns away. The molten metal that pours from the chamber is now a perfect blend of soft iron and brittle carbon. A metal that is strong but ductile, hard but malleable, and forms into solid glowing slabs, ready to span rivers and plow through the ocean. This is steel. But the steel is still red hot, with a temperature over 1,000 degrees. So the metal is transferred to a series of casters and rollers, where it's cooled with water and reduced from 75,000-pound 9-inch slabs to a ribbon just 3/4 of an inch thick. The entire furnace process takes just 2.5 hours to turn the natural mined substance of iron ore into the world's most widely used high-strength metal.
We're very proud. Without us, a lot of stuff can't be made.
incredible. I think incredible. So how does iron ore become steel? The Bessemer process. That's why the Bessemer process is so important. That's why Henry Bessemer is so important. And as you can imagine, without this steel, we don't have industry in America. A vocab term. So we do have steel, so we do industrialize, and the government does play a role in that. I want you to think about something called laissez-faire economics. It was something that first came from an idea that first came from Adam Smith, an economist who believed that the best way to sort of let the market regulate itself was to let the market regulate itself. Laissez-faire means hands off, that the government is not going to interfere in how businesses operate, not going to interfere with the economy. This is going to be the operating principle for U.S. Economics until the Great Depression, and people go, oh, maybe we should have a little bit more interference. But competition is a good thing. It's going to be more efficient. How much workers get paid is not going to be set by the government. There's no like minimum wage effort here. How much somebody gets paid is directly related to supply and demand. How much something costs is directly related to supply and demand. I also want to bring in here the idea of a tariff. A tariff is going to be brought up in our conversation several times, so it's important that we have a good base understanding of what it is, and it can be confusing. A tariff is a tax on imports. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. It means if I am an American manufacturer and I am selling a good for $1, and a British manufacturer is importing a product to America and selling it for 50 cents, the American consumer is going to choose the less expensive foreign imported good, unless the government imposes a tariff or a tax that would make that 50-cent good $1.50. Then the market is going to buy American. Northern businessmen love high tariffs because it means that more people will buy American. In the South, they hate high tariffs because Southern landowners are selling their cash crops to Europe. And if the United States places a tariff on foreign goods, those foreign countries are going to place a tariff on American goods. So high tariffs positively benefit Northern industrialists, Northern entrepreneurs, and negatively impact Southern entrepreneurs, Southern farmers. A protective tariff is a term you'll hear. A protective tariff is just a tariff that is so high that it protects American business. Railroads. In 1865, there are 35,000 miles of railroad tracks in the United States. By 1900, there are 200,000 miles of railroad tracks. This is really, really important. But railroads cannot be built without government contributions. Government gives money to companies to build a railroad. They also give land to companies to build railroads, Transcontinental Railroad in particular. It means that there's a huge potential for profit, but also that there's a huge potential for corruption. Think about this question. How did railroads affect the distribution of goods? That last slide also mentioned the time zones, which are down here. Time zones come about because of railroads. There's a need to make sure that, the train is going to leave and, arrive at the same time that you say it is. So make sure that you understand what time your train from New York is going to arrive in Kansas. So railroads spur growth. I was talking about corruption earlier. Railroad companies, the federal government would give land to railroad companies. Here are these massive tracts of land out west that are owned by the federal government that were taken from Native Americans, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, but that are owned by the government that are being given to railroad companies. Okay? Those railroad companies turn around and sell that land to settlers who are moving west. Now, why do they do this? They do this because A, it gives them money for free because that land was free, right? It also makes sure people are living out west and they become the consumers of the railroad, right? They become the ones traveling out west and back east. They're also the ones who are working in the mines potentially to make sure that there are goods being transported back east for the railroads. Railroads and other large companies are going to give rise to this idea of the robber baron, which is not a nice word. It's a derogatory term, basically, for a successful businessman. So it's going to depend on your perspective, right? Do you see people like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt? Do you see these really successful businessmen as entrepreneurs and good for them? Or do you see them as robber barons, these sort of business tycoons who are taking advantage of the American public and the American worker? This is a really well-known political cartoon. We're going to do some more with it in your folders later on. But down here at the bottom, that says the protectors of our industries. Now, you see that these robber barons are on top of this sort of raft that's being held up on the backs of workers. Many of them are immigrants that have come to the shore of our country. And you can see the different goods that are labeled on the backs of the worker that the robber barons are sitting on, and they are just holding profits. They're holding money, money from the government, money from the workers themselves. So this is obviously not going to be painting the robber barons in a very flattering light. There's a really important scandal that happens in 1872. We talked about Grant's administration being really corrupt. It's called the Credit Mobilier Scandal. Essentially, there are some stockholders of a railroad company that set up a fake construction company. Well, not necessarily fake, but essentially they're paying themselves is what ends up happening. And it involves high-level government officials, a congressman named Oakes Ames, which I always thought was a cool name, a future president, James Garfield, and a guy named Schuyler Colfax, who happened to be the vice president of the United States, implicated in a bribery scheme. There are a lot of different railroad lines. The Great Northern Railroad is one of them. There are other lines mentioned here. I just don't want you to get the impression it's one giant railroad line. And then this image, which again we'll also be looking at more closely in your folders. Railroads all travel to one destination in this image. What does the robber baron in this cartoon represent, right? Sort of gobbling up all of the railroad lines. So this is very much a to be continued conversation. Let me know if you have any questions about this portion of our topic.